The city didn't slow down for anyone, not even the broken. It glittered, roared, and pulsed like a living thing. Money in its veins, indifference in its eyes. But somewhere beneath that neon pulse, on a street too narrow for limousines and too quiet for the rich, Jeremy Vale staggered beneath a flickering streetlight. If you love beautiful, emotional, and happy ending stories, do well to hit the subscribe button to get more beautiful and happy ending stories. His world had been built from marble and market shares. Tonight, it was built from silence. He'd walked for hours, his expensive shoes soaked, his tailored coat hanging loose like a burden. The news had called him a visionary, a miracle of modern finance. The man who rebuilt 3 companies before 40. None of those headlines mentioned what he really was, alone, tired, and one breath away from collapse. He didn't even remember why he'd left his penthouse. Maybe because being surrounded by gold still felt like drowning. The night wind cut through him. He stopped beside a rusted trash bin, clutching his chest. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, a slow rebellion inside his heart. The doctors had warned him about it, but he'd ignored them. He thought money could buy him time. Couldn't. A sound escaped him halfway between a gasp and a prayer. He stumbled forward, eyes blurred with tears and rain, then fell hard. Concrete met him coldly. No one stopped. Feet walked past. Someone laughed from a distance. A car horn blared, then faded. And just as the world began to dim, he heard it. An old, trembling voice. "Oh, dear Lord. Young man, can you hear me?" A pair of fragile hands touched his shoulder. The scent of lavender and rain filled the air. "I'm calling 911. Hold on, child. You're not alone." He tried to speak, but his lips barely moved. The world tilted. The last thing he saw was the reflection of red and blue lights painting her face. A kind-hearted woman whose wrinkles looked like gentle rivers of time. Then darkness. When Jeremy opened his eyes again, everything was white. White walls, white sheets, a faint hum of machines. He blinked, confused. His body felt heavy, but his heartbeat, steady, unfamiliar, was proof he was still here. A voice, soft and clear, reached him. "You're awake." He turned his head slightly. A woman stood beside his bed, dressed in paramedic scrubs. Dark skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, and her eyes, steady, warm, impossibly calm, met his with quiet strength. "I'm Mara Ellis," she said, checking the monitor. "You collapsed on Westbrook Avenue last night. You're lucky someone found you when they did." He swallowed. His throat burned. "An old woman?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, she stayed until we arrived. You gave us a scare." He tried to sit up, but she pressed a hand gently against his chest. "Easy. You had a cardiac episode. You're stable now, but your heart's been through too much." Jeremy stared at her hand, a hand that held authority and care at once. There was something grounding in her touch, something human in a way he'd forgotten people could be. He looked around, realizing the room wasn't private. 2 other patients were visible through the curtain gaps.
No luxury suite.
No security guards. No nameplate reading Vale Industries. Good, he thought. For once, no one knew who he was. Later, when the lights dimmed and the nurses changed shifts, he asked, "How long have I been here?" "Almost 2 days," Mara replied. "You were unconscious for most of it." He nodded weakly. "You're the paramedic who found me?" "I was in the van. You were already out when we got there. And you stayed." Her eyes flicked up briefly, curious. "I always stay until my patients are stable." Jeremy wanted to say thank you, but the words caught. Gratitude wasn't something he'd had to practice in years. She seemed to sense that, because she gave him a gentle smile before walking toward the door. "Rest, mister," he interrupted softly. "Just, Jeremy." She tilted her head. "All right, Jeremy." When she left, he let out a slow breath. Her voice lingered like warmth in winter. The next day, she came again. Not as a duty, but as something else. A quiet consistency. She checked his vitals, asked if he'd eaten, reminded him to breathe deeply. He noticed her hands were steady even when her eyes looked tired. There was a sadness beneath her calm, a memory she carried but didn't speak of. That evening, as the hospital lights dimmed again, she sat by his bed after rounds. "You remind me of someone," she said suddenly. Jeremy turned toward her. "Who?" "My neighbor's son. He was 22 when he passed. Heart failure. I used to take him to appointments. He was kind, always worried about everyone else." Her gaze softened, distant. "When you came in, I thought it was him for a second. The way you looked, peaceful but gone." Silence filled the space. Jeremy didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like this, without pretense, without asking for something. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry." She smiled faintly. "It's all right. Some people leave, some stay. But sometimes, God lets us meet reminders of what we've lost, so we don't stop caring." Her words sank into him like medicine. That night, when he slept, he dreamt not of his office towers or boardrooms, but of lavender-scented air and the sound of a voice saying, "You're not alone." Morning light spilled softly through the blinds, washing the hospital room in gold. Jeremy sat up a little, his eyes tracing the light like he was rediscovering what peace looked like. The hum of monitors had become familiar, a steady rhythm that sounded almost like reassurance. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about meetings or stock indexes. He was thinking about breathing, about quiet, about the woman who always seemed to appear at the right moment. Mara Ellis walked in, carrying a clipboard and a small cup of tea. "Still here," she said with a smile. "I see you haven't run away from us yet." Jeremy chuckled weakly. "Tempting, but I'm starting to think this place might be the only reason I'm still alive." She set the tea down carefully. "That, and your stubborn heart." He looked at her, really looked, noticing the faint curls escaping from beneath her tied hair, the way her eyes softened when she teased, and the faint weariness that no sleep could quite erase. He didn't know much about her, but something told him she carried stories heavier than his fortune. Over the next week, she became part of his routine. When he walked the short hallway for his therapy laps, she was there. When the nurses forgot to check on his meal tray, she appeared. When his heart monitor beeped faster during restless nights, her calm voice steadied him. She didn't ask for thanks, or his name beyond Jeremy. He didn't offer more. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was sacred, like they both knew that words could sometimes ruin the truth. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mara sat beside his bed instead of leaving after her rounds. The hospital had grown quiet. The world outside was fading into twilight. "You know," she said softly, "I've worked here 8 years, seen hundreds of patients. Some forget your name the second they leave. Some promise they'll change, then never do. And some—" She trailed off. "Some what?" Jeremy asked. She smiled faintly. "Some remind you why you started doing this in the first place." He didn't know what to say. Something in his chest tightened. Not pain this time, but recognition. "Mara," he said after a pause, "do you ever get tired of helping people?" Her laugh was low and tired, but warm. "Every day. But it's the kind of tired that makes me feel alive. You can't explain it unless you've lost someone you wish you could have saved." He remembered her story about the neighbor's son, the boy who died too young. "Was he close to you?" he asked gently. She nodded. "He was like my little brother. His mother used to work 2 jobs. I'd check on him after shifts. When his heart started failing, we did everything we could." Her voice cracked slightly. "But some things are out of our hands." Jeremy's gaze dropped to the blanket. "You said I reminded you of him." "Yes." Her voice softened. "Not because you look the same, but because when we found you that night, something about your face. It was peace but also giving up. I couldn't let that happen again." Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things. Gratitude, memory, something tender neither wanted to name. Later, when the nurse dimmed the lights, Jeremy said quietly, I used to think success would make me untouchable. But lying here, I realized how fragile I am. All the things I built mean nothing if no one remembers I'm human. Mara looked at him for a long time before speaking. You're remembering now. That's something. He smiled faintly. Maybe you reminded me. She shrugged, trying to hide her blush. I just did my job. No, he whispered. You did more than that. Days turned into another week. Jeremy started sitting outside in the hospital garden, a small patch of green surrounded by glass walls. Mara joined him sometimes when her rounds were done. They'd talk about small things. The weather, the old woman who'd found him, he made sure she received flowers anonymously, and life before the collapse. She told him she loved gardening but never had time for it. He told her he once bought an island and never visited it. That made her laugh. An island? For what? He shrugged, smiling sheepishly. I don't know. Maybe I thought I could buy peace if I owned enough space. Did it work? Not until now. She looked at him, her eyes curious but soft. Now I realize peace isn't space, he said quietly. It's presence. Yours, maybe. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Mara blinked, taken aback. Then, instead of flinching or changing the subject, she said softly, maybe you just needed someone to remind you what still matters. He nodded, unable to look away. You did that. That night, he couldn't sleep. He watched the city lights through the hospital window, the skyline glowing like another life calling him back. But he didn't want to go back yet. He wasn't ready to lose this calm. He wasn't ready to lose her. In a quiet moment between dreams, he realized something strange. He didn't think of her as the woman who saved me. He thought of her as the person who saw him when no one else did. The next morning, Mara found him awake early, writing something in a small notebook. What's that? She asked. A list, he said with a small smile. Things I forgot to be grateful for. She raised an eyebrow. And what's on it? He turned the notebook toward her. The first few lines were neat, careful handwriting. Morning light, people who care.
Second chance.
Mara Ellis. She looked up, half laughing, half speechless. You're impossible, she whispered. Maybe, he said softly, but you're unforgettable. Their eyes met, quiet, steady, unforced. Neither moved, neither needed to. In that still moment, between beeping monitors and distant footsteps, something deeper than gratitude bloomed quietly in both hearts. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud. It was real. And for Jeremy Vale, the man who thought he'd lost everything, it was the beginning of something he never knew he needed. Love that asked for nothing. Love that simply stayed. The news broke on a Thursday morning. Mara was finishing her rounds when she passed the nurse's desk and caught sight of the small television mounted on the wall. A local news channel flashed a headline, Reclusive Billionaire Jeremy Vale Recovering Quietly in City Hospital. Her heart stopped for a moment. She turned toward the screen, and there it was, a photo of the man who'd been sitting in the hospital garden for days, sipping tea and smiling at her like he had nothing to hide. The nurse beside her gasped, "Wait! That's him. The quiet patient in Ward 7. Mara didn't answer. She just stood there, numb, as the news anchor spoke about a mysterious collapse and the once unreachable CEO of Vale Holdings. The Jeremy she knew wasn't a headline. He wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man who'd written Morning Light, Second Chances, Mara Ellis in a notebook. When she walked into his room later, he was sitting up, dressed in simple clothes, watching the same report silently on his tablet. He looked up when she entered. "Mara," he said quietly, "you saw it." She nodded, keeping her tone even. "I did." He sighed, setting the tablet aside. "I was going to tell you before it reached the press, but I waited too long." She folded her arms lightly, not in anger, just in thought. "Why didn't you?" "Because for once," he said softly, "I wanted someone to see me before they saw my money." Her expression softened just a little. "And you thought I'd treat you differently?" He met her eyes. "Everyone does. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet truth. She walked closer, the sound of her shoes soft against the linoleum. You know, she said gently, it doesn't change anything. You're still the man who forgot to eat his breakfast this morning. That caught him off guard. He smiled faintly. You noticed. I always do. The tension between them broke into silence. Warm, human, unforced. He reached for the notebook on his bedside table and handed it to her. I added something to the list, he said. She opened it. Below her name, in the same careful handwriting, was a new line. People who stay even after the truth. Her throat tightened. She closed the notebook slowly and handed it back. I'm still here, she whispered. But you don't owe me anything. I know. He looked up at her with that quiet intensity she'd grown used to. But I want to give something back. Not because I owe you, but because gratitude has to live somewhere. When he was discharged 2 days later, the hospital staff gathered briefly in the hallway. Most smiled politely. Some whispered. Cameras had begun to linger near the front gate, and the quiet ward had turned into a curious buzz. Mara watched him from a distance. He looked different in daylight, healthier, taller, almost regal in the simplicity of his gray sweater and jeans. Yet something in his eyes remained humble, softer than the man on the news. He walked over to her, hands in his pockets. So, he said, this is goodbye? She smiled. This is, take care of yourself. Will you? He asked, almost boyishly. She tilted her head. Will I what? Let me see you again. Somewhere that doesn't smell like antiseptic. Her lips curved into a faint smile. That depends. On what? On whether you remember to eat breakfast tomorrow. He laughed then. Really laughed, the sound echoing in the sterile hallway like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the patient, but the man beneath it all. Human, grateful, open. A week passed. Mara's shifts grew longer. Life returned to normal or tried to, but sometimes while writing her reports, she'd think of the notebook. Of his voice saying, gratitude has to live somewhere. She missed him quietly without realizing it. Then one evening, as she left the hospital, she saw a familiar figure leaning against a modest black car parked near the gate. Jeremy. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or assistants. Just standing there with 2 cups of coffee in hand and that same patient smile. I thought you might be off shift by now, he said. One's for you. Decaf. I remember you said caffeine makes you restless. She blinked, surprised. You remembered? Every word. He offered her the cup, and she accepted it, fingers brushing his briefly. The warmth traveled deeper than the coffee. Shouldn't you be somewhere important? She teased. Like signing a $1 billion contract? He smiled. Maybe this is important. They stood there, side by side, as cars passed and the city lights blinked awake. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt natural, like the space between heartbeats. Finally, Mara asked, do you ever get tired of people wanting something from you? He thought for a moment. I used to, but you never wanted anything. That's what makes me want to give you everything. She looked up, meeting his eyes. You don't owe me anything, Jeremy. I know. His voice softened. That's what makes it real. They started meeting after that. Quietly, simply. No tabloids, no headlines. Just 2 people sharing corners of the world that didn't belong to the noise. Sometimes it was coffee before her night shifts. Sometimes it was a short walk in the hospital garden, the same one where he'd learned how to breathe again. He told her about his late mother, who'd taught him humility before wealth replaced it. She told him about the little boy she'd lost, the one who'd made her believe in miracles before leaving too soon. Their stories became bridges, not walls. And somewhere between the silences, their hearts learned a new rhythm together. One evening, Jeremy confessed something quietly, his gaze lowered. The night I collapsed, I wasn't just sick. I was done. I didn't want to live anymore. I thought I'd built everything worth having, but it all felt hollow. Mara's eyes softened. her hand resting gently on his. And now, he looked at her, deeply honestly. Now I want to live every day I get. Because someone reminded me that I'm still capable of being loved. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The wind carried her quiet smile, and the city lights reflected in his eyes like tiny promises. In that moment, the billionaire and the paramedic were just two souls who'd found each other at the edge of breaking, and decided to stay. Autumn came softly, brushing the city with gold. The hospital garden was nearly empty now, except for a pair of figures sitting on the same bench where they had shared so many quiet mornings. Jeremy Vale, no longer the withdrawn billionaire, no longer the man who had collapsed under the weight of his own empire, sat beside Mara Ellis, his hands loosely folded over hers. They didn't talk much anymore. They didn't need to. Some hearts speak best in silence. "Do you ever think about that night?" Mara asked softly, watching a leaf drift down from a nearby maple tree. "All the time," Jeremy replied. "Sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else. Sometimes I wonder if I really would have survived if that old woman hadn't stopped." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "But most days I think about what came after." Mara smiled faintly. "Hospital beds and bland oatmeal?" He chuckled. "You." Her smile deepened. "You've become quite the poet lately." He shrugged playfully. "Near-death experiences tend to unlock that part of you." They laughed quietly together. The kind of laugh that heals, not entertains. For a moment, everything was still. Then Jeremy said something he'd been holding for weeks. "I never told you what I thought when I first woke up in that hospital." Mara tilted her head. "What was it?" "That you looked familiar. Not because I'd seen you before, but because you looked like hope." She blinked, caught between laughter and tears. "That's a heavy compliment, Jeremy." "It's the truth," he said. "I'd forgotten what that looked like." As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened quietly, untouched by noise or gossip. Jeremy kept his public life separate. He attended meetings again, but he no longer rushed to fill every silence. The old restlessness that once defined him had softened into something else. Gratitude. Mara, still working at the hospital, found herself smiling more. Her colleagues noticed the change, though few asked. She often caught herself replaying moments. His quiet humor, his warmth, the way he always waited for her outside after her shifts, even when he didn't have to. Neither of them made grand promises. They didn't need to. They simply showed up. Every time. One Friday evening, just as the city lights began to blink alive, Jeremy asked if she'd take a short walk with him. They drove quietly through streets glowing under amber lamps until he stopped near a narrow alley, the same one where everything had begun. The place had changed. The trash bin was gone, replaced by a small mural painted on the brick wall, bright blues and yellows forming a single word, kindness. He looked at it for a long moment before speaking. "This is where I fell," he said quietly, "and where someone chose not to walk away." Mara turned toward him. "And where someone learned to get back up." He smiled. "You're part of both." They stood there side by side, letting the night breathe between them. Cars passed in the distance. A faint hum of life echoed from the city beyond. But here, in this small forgotten corner, it felt like time had paused just for them. Jeremy took her hand gently, his thumb brushing the back of it. "When I think of that night now," he said, "I don't remember the pain. I remember your voice. You weren't even there yet, but somehow, it's your voice I hear when I think of survival." Mara's eyes glistened. "Maybe your heart already knew what it was waiting for." He smiled softly. "It was waiting for you." They walked a little further, ending up at a small cafe tucked between old brick buildings. He held the door for her. A simple gesture, yet it meant everything. Inside, soft jazz played from an old speaker. The scent of cinnamon and rain drifted in from the street. They sat by the window, 2 cups of coffee, the kind of peace that doesn't need to be proven. "I sometimes think about the boy you told me about," Jeremy said quietly. "The one who passed." Mara nodded slowly. "I think about him too. He was kind. He wanted to live so much, but his heart couldn't keep up. Jeremy reached across the table and held her hand gently. Maybe you couldn't save him because you were meant to save someone else later. She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. You're giving that night too much meaning. No, he said. I'm giving it the meaning it deserves. They finished their coffee in silence, watching the city's reflection ripple across the wet pavement outside. When they stepped out again, the air was cool and alive. Jeremy paused under the streetlight, the same kind of glow that had watched him collapse once. He turned to her. Do you ever feel like we don't find love? It just finds us when we've stopped running? He asked. Mara looked up at him, her voice calm. I think love finds us when we finally become quiet enough to listen. He nodded, his gaze holding hers. I used to think I was untouchable, Mara. Now I know I was just unreachable. And now? She asked. He took a slow breath, his words simple and true. Now I'm right where I want to be. He lifted her hand and kissed it gently, not as an act of romance but reverence, the quiet gratitude of a man reborn. Weeks later, a quiet headline appeared on a local blog. Billionaire funds community care program for first responders. Says inspiration came from a woman who reminded me to live. Mara saw it on her phone during a break. She smiled, shaking her head. He hadn't told her. Typical of him, always humble in the ways that mattered. When she saw him that evening, he simply shrugged. It was overdue, he said. If I learned anything from you, it's that gratitude should move. He looked at her, eyes gentle. Love should stay. Do you still write in that notebook? She murmured. He smiled, pulling it from his pocket and flipping to the last page. Under the old entries, a new one stood alone. Home, not a place, but a person. She traced the words lightly, her eyes soft. That's a good one, she whispered. He closed the notebook and tucked it away, pressing his forehead gently against hers. I learned it from you, he said. The city below continued to move, lights flickering, lives crossing, people hurrying past one another. But up here, time slowed. Two hearts that once lived in different worlds now beat quietly in sync. Proof that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin in the simplest act of kindness. And under the soft glow of that Manhattan night, Jeremy Vale and Mara Ellis didn't promise forever. They simply promised today. And for two souls who had almost lost everything, that was more than enough. Their love grew stronger as they took it one step at a time.